I heard the raven before I heard the horn. Not the casual call of a bird over a field. This was different. It cut through the mist like a warning that didn't need words. The kind of sound that makes you look up even when you already know what's coming. The morning was cold, and the fog sat low across the Northumbrian hills, thick enough to swallow distance and turn the world into a narrow circle of breath and shadow. My cloak pulled hard in the wind, heavy with damp. Beneath it, iron pressed into my shoulders, mail, leather, the weight of a crown that never truly leaves your body even when you take it off. I stood on the ridge and tried to see the land below, but the mist kept most of it hidden. Still, I knew it was there. Valleys with farms and fences, old forests, roads that traced the bones of Rome, and far beyond that, the faint cold glitter of the sea. This island has worn so many names. Britannia, the Romans called it, as if naming a thing was the same as owning it. Then they left, and the name stayed behind like a ghost. After them came our kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, each gripping its own piece, each fighting as if the whole world ended at the edge of a river. And now I held them all. They call me Æthelstan, King of the English, a title that still feels new in the mouth, like a word the world hasn't fully agreed to yet. My grandfather Alfred held the line when the Northmen seemed unstoppable. My father Edward gathered what he could and never stopped moving forward. And I did the thing no one could do without making enemies. I made the fragments touch. I pushed them into the shape of one realm. England. But a realm isn't only land. A realm is belief. It's men who once fought each other standing under one banner and deciding together that the banner matters more than old grudges. That belief is exactly what my enemies came for. Because beyond the fog, beyond the ridges, 3 kings watched my England like hungry men watching a fire they didn't light. Constantine of Alba, Scotland's old wolf, had bent his knee once, the way a man does when survival demands it. But I saw his eyes that day. His knee bowed, his will did not. Olaf Guthfrithson of Dublin was younger, sharper, restless as the sea. He carried the legacy of Viking kings in his blood, and the memory of York in his ambition. He wanted the North back, not as a memory, but as a kingdom. And Owen of Strathclyde, a man pressed between powers, defending a shrinking space, fighting not for glory, but for breath, for his people, for his corner of the old world that my new world threatened to surround. 3 rulers, 3 reasons, one shared fear, that if England held, their future would narrow. I understood them in a way. If I were in their place, watching a single crown rise in the south, watching borders harden, laws spread, tribute flow, I might have called it hunger, I might have called it tyranny, I might have called it the end of my freedom. But understanding an enemy does not lessen him, it only sharpens the choice in front of you. The wind rose again, colder now, as if the north itself was breathing down my neck. Behind me my warlords waited, men of Wessex and Mercia, men of East Anglia, men of Northumbria who still remembered other kings and other tongues. They stood in their cloaks and mail, gripping spear shafts, watching my face, listening for the kind of certainty only a king is expected to provide. I turned to them and I let my voice carry over the ridge. "My lords," I said, "the raven is gathering in the north." Heads lifted, eyes narrowed. They knew the signs as well as I did. Messengers arriving too often, coastal rumors, refugees with half-told stories, scouts returning with ash on their boots. "The wolf is sharpening its teeth," I said, "and the sea is restless with ships." The wind snapped the dragon banner behind us, and for a moment it sounded like a living thing. Cloth, wood, and weather, nothing more, and yet every man there felt what it meant. A symbol only works when men are willing to live inside it. "They believe we are weak," I said. "They believe our unity is only words. They believe the name England is nothing but breath, easy to take, easy to scatter." I stepped closer, letting them see that this wasn't a speech for comfort. This was a warning and a promise at the same time. But they are wrong. Not shouted, spoken like a fact. We have stood when we were fewer. We have held when we were divided. We have rebuilt after fire and loss. And now we stand together. Wessex and Mercia, North and South, men who once carried different loyalties, now under one crown. I saw it in their faces, doubt fighting pride, fear fighting duty, because they all knew the truth beneath my words.
A new kingdom is strongest at the center and weakest at the seams, and our seams were still fresh. Yet that was also the point. This war was not only about land, it was about whether a man in Mercia would fight beside a man from Wessex and call it the same home, whether a Northumbrian would raise his shield for an English king against the sea raiders he once served. It was about whether England was real. I raised my hand and pressed my fist once against the iron at my chest, not to perform, but to make the promise physical. They come to steal our future, I said. They come to pull us back into the old darkness, back into fragments, back into border feuds, back into the days when any strong man with ships could take what he wanted. The wind carried my words, but I made sure they were simple enough to survive the wind. We will not give it to them. For a moment, there was only the sound of cloaks snapping and horses shifting their weight behind the lines. Then one man struck the rim of his shield with his spear butt, another followed, then another, until the ridge answered with the heavy rhythm of iron on wood. Not celebration, a vow. I looked north again. The fog was still there, but now it felt thinner, not because it had moved, but because my mind had made its decision. Somewhere out there, Constantine was thinking like an old general, measuring risk and pride. Somewhere out there, Olaf was tasting victory in his imagination, seeing York as if it were already under his hand. Somewhere out there, Owen was telling himself he had no choice but to stand with them. And I, Æthelstan, stood on a ridge with a kingdom that was still young enough to break. A modern mind might call this politics, strategy, state formation, but when you're the one wearing the crown, it feels simpler and heavier than any theory. It feels like this: if you hold, your people can begin to believe in peace. If you fail, you leave them a map of ruins. I turned back to my men one last time. Send word, I said, to every shire, to every burgh, to every thane and every freeman who holds land by my law. The dragon banner is raised. England calls her sons. There was no flourish, no poetry, only the cold clarity of what was coming. Then I stepped toward my horse. The leather creaked. Iron shifted on my shoulders. A huscarl handed me my helmet, its metal cold as river stone, and as I took it, I felt the moment tighten, like a door closing behind us. Ahead lay the north. Ahead lay a field whose name the world would remember long after the men who fought there turned back into earth. And as the raven cried again over the mist, I mounted and rode forward, because a king does not get to wait for the storm. He rides to meet it.
People like to imagine that England has always existed, like a shape on a map that was just waiting to be colored in. But that isn't how it felt from where I stood. England wasn't a thing you could point to and say, there, that's been here forever. England was new enough to creak when it moved. When I was a child, the island was still a patchwork of rival crowns and half-healed wounds. The North remembered Norse kings. Mercia remembered being powerful. Wessex remembered being alone. And in every valley and along every river, loyalty was small, measured in fields, in family names, in local oaths. So when people speak about me as if I simply inherited a kingdom, I have to correct them, even now. What I inherited was a direction, a hard-won sense that survival demanded more than courage. It demanded structure. My grandfather, Alfred, understood that before anyone else truly did. He didn't just fight, he organized. He built fortified towns, burghs, so raids couldn't gut the countryside overnight. He pushed law and learning, not as decoration, but as tools. He wanted people to think of themselves as something larger than a single village, because that kind of thinking is what keeps a realm standing when pressure comes. My father, Edward, carried that forward. He didn't slow down. He gathered land and loyalty the way a careful man gathers firewood, enough to last through winter, enough to keep the hearth alive. Step by step, he pushed English power outward, not with one dramatic act, but with relentless motion. And then the crown passed to me. I took the throne in the mid-900s. I was not a boy, but I was young enough that older kings looked at me and assumed I could be pushed, outmaneuvered, frightened into compromise. They were wrong about the fear, but they weren't wrong about the danger. Because by the time I wore the crown, the greatest threat wasn't only outside the borders anymore. The threat was that the kingdom could split at the seams, that our unity could be nothing more than a thin layer of authority stretched over old rivalries. So I did what kings must do when they have no choice. I moved first. Mercia was absorbed, not without tension,
not without resentment, but it was done. And then my gaze went north, towards York, towards Northumbria, toward the place where Norse rule had sunk its roots deeper than anywhere else on English soil. When York came under my control in the late 920s, everything changed. People who hadn't been paying attention suddenly looked up, because York wasn't just another town. York was a key. It was the hinge of the North. It was the proof that the old Viking hold on England could be broken. After that, the map stopped looking like a scattered set of kingdoms and started looking dangerously like one realm. That was the moment I began using the title that carried the most weight, King of the English. Not King of Wessex, not King of the West Saxons, not a ruler of one region among many. King of the English. Even the sound of it was a challenge, because titles are not just words, they are claims. They tell every neighboring ruler what you intend to become, and if you intend to become something bigger, you announce it, and then you prepare for the backlash. In a modern sense, you could say I was centralizing power. You could say I was building institutions. You could say I was forcing a political merger across cultures that didn't naturally trust each other. All of that is true, but it's too clean, too academic. On the ground, what it meant was this. If a man in Mercia and a man in Wessex were going to live under the same crown, they needed to feel that the crown did more than demand. It had to protect. It had to organize. It had to make daily life safer than it had been under the old chaos. So yes, we used armies, but we also used law. We used coinage. We used a steady presence of fortified towns and patrols and courts. We used agreements and marriages and patronage, every method that could bind land to authority without having to fight for every mile forever. And we used ceremony. People underestimate ceremony, especially people who live in ages where power hides behind paperwork. But in my world, a public ritual could do what a written treaty often couldn't. It could force an enemy to acknowledge you in front of witnesses, in front of their own men. And it could also plant a seed of hatred that would grow quietly until it found the right moment to bloom. That is where Constantine enters the story. Constantine of Alba, King of Scots, was no reckless raider. He was old enough to have seen a lifetime of shifting borders, old enough to understand that a strong neighbor is always a question waiting to be asked. He had fought Vikings. He had watched old identities in the north change shape. He carried the mindset of a man who thinks in decades, not seasons. At one point, he swore oaths to me. The details of those meetings matter less than the truth behind them. The balance of power had shifted enough that he had to recognize it, at least outwardly. I remember that moment, not because it was triumphant, but because it was revealing. A man can kneel and still remain standing inside himself. His body lowered, his eyes did not. There was a fire there, cold, contained, and patient. The look of a king who tells himself, not today, but someday. And I understood him, not as a friend, as a rival who saw the future narrowing. Because if England held together, if I was allowed time to make my rule feel normal, then the borders of Alba would begin to look less like a line between equals and more like the edge of an expanding order. Whether I intended that future or not, the fear was enough to make him move. That is the irony of building a kingdom. The stronger you make your realm, the more you convince others that you must be stopped now before you become unstoppable. By the end of the 920s and into the following decade, my England was no longer an experiment whispered about in southern halls. It was a fact that changed how every king around us slept. The Welsh princes had felt the pressure. The Norse in Dublin watched and remembered what had been lost. Strathclyde looked at the map and saw walls closing in. And Constantine watched all of it with the gaze of a man counting down. Somewhere along the way, I realized that this was no longer just about me. It wasn't even only about my dynasty. It was about whether people could accept a new identity that was larger than their local past, whether the word England could become something more than a royal slogan. A modern observer might say that nations are built through shared administration, shared economy, shared law, shared narrative, that they are not natural phenomena, but human inventions reinforced over time. I would agree, and I would add something simpler. A nation is built when people decide the same danger is theirs and the same future is worth defending. That decision was beginning to take shape. Not everywhere, not evenly. Winchester looked calm the day the world began to tighten around my throat. From the outside, you would have seen the same things you always see in a capital at peace. Smoke rising from hearths, carts rolling over damp streets, merchants calling out prices, a bell from a stone church marking the hours. Ordinary life, carrying on as if it had no idea what was gathering beyond the horizon. But in the great hall, nothing was ordinary. I sat alone at a long table with a rough map of Britain spread out before me. Hide and wax, scratched lines for rivers and roads, simple markers for towns and borders. Around it lay the reports, scout notes, frightened stories from travelers, messages intercepted and hurriedly copied by scribes. Every piece by itself felt like rumor. Together, they formed a shape I couldn't ignore. They were coming. Not as raiders this time, not as a single kingdom testing my border. This was different, wider, heavier, a coalition. Multiple rulers, multiple banners, moving with the same intent. Scots, Vikings, Britons. All pointed at the north of my realm like a spear aimed at the ribs. I ran a finger along the map toward York. Northumbria was the hinge of everything I had built. If the enemy could burn it, unsettle it, or seize it, if they could make the people there believe I could not protect them, then my new kingdom would begin to fracture the way old cloth tears along a seam. That was the true danger, not simply losing land, losing belief. They wanted speed, they wanted terror, they wanted to strike before I could pull my realm together and prove it could move as one. They believed unity was just ink, just ceremony, a title on a coin. And I'll admit, for a moment I asked myself a question I would never speak aloud in the hall. Could this New England truly hold? Wessex had its pride, Mercia had its old wounds, Northumbria had been conquered too recently to feel settled. Men who had once been enemies were now expected to stand shield to shield as if history had never happened. It is easy to declare a kingdom. It is harder to make it real in the hearts of the men who must bleed for it. I rose and walked to the window. Outside, Winchester's roofs glistened with damp. The city breathed, unaware. My reflection hovered faintly in the glass, mail at my shoulders, a king's cloak heavy on my back, a face that looked older than it had any right to look. I thought of the men coming against me. Constantine did not come for glory. He came because he believed England would swallow Alba if he waited. He was an old wolf, the kind that does not waste strength, the kind that bites when it must. Olaf of Dublin came for conquest, for York, for a legacy he thought was his by blood and sea. Younger, hotter, dangerous in a different way. The kind of man whose certainty could set whole camps on fire. And Owain of Strathclyde came because he felt the walls closing in. When a ruler believes there is no room left to breathe, he becomes capable of desperate choices. 3 leaders, 1 fragile alliance. I knew their weakness. They were joined by hatred, not trust. Their plan depended on striking fast and breaking me quickly. If the fight became long, if the cost grew high, the cracks between them would widen. But knowing an enemy's weakness doesn't make the enemy harmless. Not when they were many, not when England was still new. I turned back from the window, and the decision settled in me like iron cooling in water, hardening, becoming final. There would be no waiting, no negotiation, no hope that the storm would turn aside. If they were coming to test whether England was real, then England would answer them in the only language an invading coalition truly understands. A united host on the road, a wall of shields on the field, and a king who does not hide behind his men. I called for a servant. My voice was sharper than I intended, but it did not matter. This was not a moment for softness. I said, "Send riders to every shire, to every burh, to every thane and every free man who holds land by my grant. The dragon banner is raised. England calls her sons." The servant bowed and ran, sandals slapping the floorboards, vanishing through the hall doors into the bright gray day. And just like that, the kingdom began to move. In Winchester, scribes bent over parchment, wax warmed over flame, seals pressed down hard and lifted clean. Messengers tightened girths, checked straps, mounted horses. Gates swung open with the slow groan of iron and wood, and riders spilled onto Roman roads like sparks thrown from a fire. Word traveled the way it always did in our age, by hoofbeat, by breath, by rumor that turned into certainty as it passed from mouth to mouth. In Wessex, men heard the call and reached for spears kept above doorways. In East Anglia, thanes gathered their household troops and sent boys to fetch shields. In Mercia, where the idea of England still felt unfamiliar, like a stranger in the doorway, the call landed differently. Not as pride, as a question. I saw that question in my mind as clearly as if I stood there myself, because I knew what Mercia had been. Independent, strong, proud enough to resent a southern king. And yet, Mercia had also been bruised by Vikings, raided, taxed, bled. Its people had lived through enough to understand the cost of being divided. I imagine a farmstead near Tamworth where a herald rides in with a dragon standard above his shoulder. The yard smells of smoke and wet earth. Farmers pause in their work. A blacksmith looks up from his anvil. Older men narrow their eyes, remembering the last time a banner came with demands. The herald speaks, voice carrying the authority of the crown. The enemy gathers in the north. They come to break the realm and drag us back into fear. The dragon banner is raised. England calls her sons. And I can almost hear the silence that follows, heavy, suspicious. An old man steps forward. He leans on a staff. His hair is thin, his hands calloused, his eyes tired in the way only decades can make. He asks, "England? I fought Wessex once. I fought the Danes. Now I fight for England? What is that word to me?" It is not a foolish question. It is the question at the heart of everything I have built. Then a younger man speaks, someone who has lost enough to understand what's at stake. He grips a newly hafted axe, knuckles white. "My brother fell at York, fighting for the English king. If the North falls, the old terror returns. I won't watch that happen. I fight. For my land. For what we're trying to build." And in that moment, the word begins to change. Not because it is beautiful, because it is useful. Because it offers something the old world rarely offered. A chance that the next generation might not live by constant alarm. The old man looks at the banner again. And he straightens, slowly, like a door being forced open by a steady hand. "I've lived through enough wars. I would like my grandson to know peace. If this king can forge it, then I stand." He does not shout, he simply decides. One by one, others decide too. They pick up shields that have hung unused. They sharpen farm tools until they can serve as weapons. They tie straps and adjust belts. The road north is never just a road. It is a test of patience, of discipline, of whether men who come from different corners of a realm can keep the same rhythm for days at a time. It is mud that steals your boots, wind that finds every gap in your cloak, nights that offer too little rest, and mornings that arrive too quickly. And yet, we moved, mile after mile, like a river of iron. From the head of the column, I could see the dragon banner pulling forward in the wind, the cloth snapping as if it were alive. Behind it came the heart of my host. West Saxon household troops in ringed mail, then the Mercians, some well-armed, many not, then men from East Anglia and the old Danelaw, then Northumbrians who had once lived under Norse rule and now marched under an English king. If you stood beside the road and watched us pass, you would have seen more than soldiers. You would have seen a kingdom trying to hold itself together in motion. I rode at the front, as a king should, not because I believed I was invincible, but because I understood something simple. Men fight better when they can see the person asking them to fight. Edmund rode near me, my brother, my heir, young enough that the weight of it still sat awkwardly on his shoulders, but fierce enough to carry it anyway. He watched the line behind us with the kind of focus that tells you he was already learning to think like a ruler. At times, the road rose to a ridge, and I could look back and see the column stretching across the land, disappearing over hills and into wooded dips. It was a sight that made even me swallow hard. Not because I was afraid of my own army, because I knew what it represented. Wessex had once fought Mercia. Mercia had once hated Wessex. Northumbria had been taken by force. Old loyalties still lived in the bones of men. And yet they marched together now, under one banner, for one purpose. If England had a soul, this is what it looked like. Different men agreeing, for one season at least, to act like one people. But even as I watched them, I could not allow myself to be comforted. Across the north, other men were moving too. Men who had their own banners, their own pride, their own reasons to hate the word I was trying to make real. Constantine's Alba was not soft. Those were seasoned warriors, hardened by border fighting and harsh terrain, men who knew how to stand in a line and push without breaking. Olaf's Dublin force, those were different. Raiders and fighters born to sea and sudden violence, hungry for reward, restless by nature. Dangerous not only because of their skill, but because of their fire. Owen's Strathclyde Britons were the sort of enemy you should never underestimate. They fought with the desperation of people who believed there was nowhere left to retreat. Numbers mattered, of course. I knew we might be facing a host larger than ours, but numbers are not the only thing that decides a day. The rhythm of a line, the willingness to hold when breath turns to pain, the ability to keep a plan when fear begins to shout. Those things decide battles too. I said something like that to Edmund when we paused on a rise. "Look at them," I told him, nodding toward the column behind us. "Not just the weapons, look at the will. They march for their homes, for the peace we've tried to build. They march for England." Edmund didn't answer quickly. He was watching the same thing I was watching, but he was also seeing the question behind it. "They march because you called, because you made it real. But is it enough against what's coming?" There are moments when a king must speak as if there is no doubt, even when doubt is present. Not because the king is lying, but because the realm cannot afford to hear uncertainty from the top. It must be enough. If we fall, everything falls. Back to fragments, back to darkness. We hold, we win. There is no other choice. Then we rode on. The farther north we went, the colder the air became. The land changed, trees thinned, heath spread. The wind cut cleaner, sharper. The world felt less like a settled kingdom and more like a frontier that still remembered older wars. And while my host moved like a river, the coalition gathered like a storm. Near the borderlands, around rivers and passes where travel was possible, Constantine's warriors arrived first. Scots in wool and mail, shields aligned, their discipline visible even before they fought. They were not singing, they were not boasting, they were preparing. Then came Olaf. From the west, ships cut through gray water and slid onto shore. Longships disgorged men who moved with the loose confidence of those who live by the sea. They brought axes and spears, shields painted with symbols, voices loud enough to carry over wind. And then Owen's Strathclyde Britons arrived, quieter than the Vikings, but no less determined. Their shields bore ancient patterns, their faces carried the look of people who had made peace with hard choices. For a brief moment, the coalition must have felt unstoppable. 3 peoples, 3 kings, joining into something larger than any one of them. But I have learned, the hard way, that the first weakness of any alliance is not in the weapons. It is in the heart. Hate can unite men, yes, but hate also burns fast. Constantine would have looked at Olaf and seen a young man who wanted York more than he wanted stability. Olaf would have looked at Constantine and seen an old king moving too slowly for a clean victory. Owen would have looked at both of them and wondered which one would abandon him first if the day went badly. That is the truth of alliances made under pressure. They hold best at the beginning when everyone believes victory is close. It was along the river Amont, or somewhere like it, that the leaders met. 3 kings standing near each other with their bodyguards close, the air tense, the ground damp, the wind cold. I wasn't there, but I can imagine it clearly because I understand those men. Olaf would have been impatient, eyes bright, voice sharp. "Where is the English dog?" he would have demanded. "Let us find him, let us take York before winter." Owen would have answered with caution. "Fury is useful, but discipline wins. We must strike together, not as scattered hands." And Constantine would have raised a hand and forced them both into silence, because old kings know how to command a room without shouting. "Olaf, your hunger is a weapon. Sheathe it until the moment. Owen, your caution is a shield, but do not hide behind it. We are united. For now. We move east, we choose ground, we break Æthelstan." For now. That phrase matters, because even Constantine would have felt it, that their unity was a rope tied by necessity, not trust, and ropes tied in haste can snap when strain comes. Still, they moved. The combined host turned eastward, towards the place where they believed they could force me into battle on terms that favored them. They wanted open ground, space to spread out, room for numbers to matter, a battlefield that would let them crush a new kingdom before it learned to span. And I rode at the front, from the south, because I could not allow them to roam through Northumbria unchallenged. I could not let them burn villages and forts and make my rule look weak. So we marched, and they marched, and the land between us grew smaller each day. You can feel that kind of convergence before you see it. Scouts return more often. The air seems sharper. Men talk less at night. Fires burn lower. Even the horses seem to sense it, restless and quiet.
We reached the field at sundown. The march had hardened the men, mud in their hems, grit in their teeth, the quiet discipline that only comes when an army has been moving for days with one thought in its head. And yet when the valley opened before us, even the veterans fell silent. Brunanburh, whatever the place was truly called by farmers who lived nearby, lay wide and open beneath a bruised evening sky. Gentle slopes, enough space for thousands to stand shoulder to shoulder. A low river line glinting in the distance, the suggestion of a ford. Ground that favored a larger host. Ground the coalition had chosen. I sat my horse on the ridge and let my eyes take it in like a judge weighing a case. The wind tasted of damp grass and smoke, and then I saw the fires, faint, scattered points of orange at the far end of the valley. Enemy campfires, already lit, already waiting. They were there first, and they wanted me to know it. I dismounted and walked forward, boots sinking slightly into wet turf. My cloak tugged at my shoulders. The dragon banner snapped behind me, and I could feel the eyes of my commanders fixed on my back, as if they were reading my posture for clues. It was perfect ground for them. Too perfect. They expected spectacle. They expected a grand clash where weight of numbers could do what cleverness could not. They believed they could crush my new realm on the first hard test and send England back into its familiar fragments. And I understood the truth beneath their confidence. A kingdom that has only recently become one is always easiest to break at the beginning. You strike it before the joints tighten, before loyalty becomes a habit, before the people stop thinking in old names and start thinking in one. This field would either be England's cradle or its grave. We made camp with method, not panic, fires in shallow pits, tents where we could manage them, shields stacked in orderly lines, men cooking quietly, mending straps, checking spear sockets, sharpening edges with slow, practiced movements. In the last light, the metal of helmets looked almost black, as if it had absorbed the coming night. I walked through the camp as the sky faded. I did not give grand speeches, not here, not now. I spoke only when necessary, and when I did, I kept it simple. A king's words on the eve of battle should not be poetry. They should be something men can hold on to when their arms begin to shake. Some prayed, some stared into the distance, some sat with their backs against their shields and tried not to imagine the morning. No matter how many times a man has faced war, the night before the next one always feels unfamiliar. I stopped near a group of Northumbrian huscarls, men with hard eyes and worn gear, fighters who had survived under Norse kings and now stood under my banner. Their leader was a veteran named Osric, scarred and steady, the kind of man who didn't waste words. He rose as I approached, and the others shifted to make room, respectful but not worshipful. Northumbria was not a land that loved being ruled. Osric looked at me and spoke the question I knew lived in many minds. "We stand with you, King Æthelstan," he said, "against the Scots, against the Vikings, against our past." His voice tightened slightly. "But is this England worth such a price?" In another time, a king might have answered with pride, might have spoken of glory or destiny. But I had learned that men who have seen enough death do not trust glory. So I answered him the only way that mattered. "Look around you," I said quietly. "Men of Wessex, men of Mercia, men of Northumbria, we stand together tonight because the enemy would destroy us all, no matter what our past was. They don't come to punish one region, they come to break the idea that we can be one people." Osric watched my face, weighing every word. "If we lose," I continued, "we go back to the days when loyalty ends at a boundary marker, back to the days when raiders take what they want and kings answer with revenge instead of law. I offer something different, one law, one crown, a peace that lasts longer than one season." I held his gaze. "That is England,
And yes, it is worth the price, because without it, we are prey again. For a moment, Osric didn't move. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate, like a door finally closing on an old doubt. "For England," he said. The huscarls around him murmured the words as if testing them. Some sounded unsure, some sounded fierce, but they said them. And in that small circle by the fire, I felt something shift, not in the battle itself, but in the meaning behind it. England was no longer only my claim, it was beginning to become theirs. Across the valley, the coalition camp felt very different. Their fires were larger, more numerous, louder. From our side we could hear distant boasting and singing, the sound of men trying to convince themselves that tomorrow would be simple. I imagined Constantine's warriors sitting apart, sharpening axes in disciplined silence. I imagined Olaf's Vikings roaring with restless excitement. I imagined Owen's Britons huddled in smaller groups, quiet and grim. And then, near a central fire, I pictured the three kings meeting again, three rulers bound together by necessity and strained by it. Olaf would have wanted an immediate strike. That was the Viking instinct. Hit first, hit hard, break the enemy before the enemy can settle into a wall. He would have looked at my camp and seen the calm and interpreted it as fear. Owen would have argued for restraint. He knew what a disciplined shield wall could do to a reckless charge. He would have urged unity, timing, patience, because a smaller kingdom survives by choosing the right moment, not by wasting men. And Constantine would have been the one measuring the danger inside their own alliance. He would have seen how thin their trust was, how quickly impatience could turn into blame, how easily fear could replace confidence if the battle did not end fast. That was the paradox of the coalition. They had come together because they feared my strength, but they were three different fires. If the day went poorly, those fires could turn inward. And I knew something else too. My men were not all one people by birth, but on this field they were one army under one command. I could give an order and expect it to be carried down the line as one voice. The coalition could not say the same. Night deepened. The valley grew colder. Fog began to creep back into the low ground, softening the distance between the camps. Fires blurred into floating points of light. I returned to my tent and sat with my helmet resting on a chest beside me. Iron, leather, a simple thing, and yet it felt like the boundary between the world that existed and the world that might exist after tomorrow. Edmund came in later. His face was streaked with grime, his eyes tired but bright with a kind of fierce readiness. He did not speak at first. He didn't need to. We both knew what this meant. If we won, England would become something no one could dismiss again. If we lost, the realm would fracture, and every old enemy would come back with new confidence. Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere, a horse snorted. A sentry's footsteps moved past in steady rhythm. Beyond that, beyond the darkness and fog, tens of thousands of men were trying to rest before they rose to test each other at dawn. I lay down, but sleep came in fragments. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the field again, open, waiting, chosen to favor the larger host. But the thought that returned to me again and again was not fear of their numbers. It was the simple truth that tomorrow, for the first time, the word England would be weighed not in ceremonies or titles, but in a single day of endurance. At some point before dawn, the camp grew quiet in that particular way that only happens when most men have stopped talking and begun listening to their own breathing. I held that silence for a moment, and then I whispered the only prayer that mattered. Hold. Hold the line. Hold the realm. Hold the meaning. Because when the sun rose over Brunanburh, the world would learn whether England was real.
Dawn at Brunanburh didn't arrive like a sunrise. It arrived like a lid lifting, slow, reluctant, and cold. A thick gray mist lay across the valley floor, clinging to the grass and rolling in low waves around our boots. The world felt narrowed to a few paces in every direction. You couldn't see the far ridge clearly. You couldn't count banners. You couldn't read the enemy's face. You could only hear them, muffled movement, distant horns, the restless murmur of thousands of men preparing to step into the same patch of earth. On our side, the English line formed with a quiet precision that felt almost unnatural for a kingdom still learning to be won. Shields came together edge to edge, spear shafts slid into position under arm and over rim. Men adjusted their footing in the mud so the line would not drift. The dragon banner stood near the center like a fixed point in a moving world, snapping sharply whenever the wind found it. I stood there with them, at the heart of the wall, helmet cold against my brow, breath steaming in the air. I could feel the pressure of the moment in the way hands tightened on wood and leather, and the way men stopped speaking because speech wasted breath. This was no raid, no skirmish, no quick punishment. This was a test of whether a new name, England, could stand against older powers that wanted it undone. Across the mist, the coalition gathered into shape like a shadow becoming solid. Not one army, but several, stitched together by need. The Scots in the center, disciplined and steady. The Vikings on one flank, restless, fast, loud even through the fog. The Britons on the other, compact and grim, fighting as if their homes were already behind them in flames. For a long moment we simply faced each other, separated by a stretch of empty ground that felt larger than it was. The silence was so complete it seemed to press on the ears. Then an English horn cut through it, sharp, clean, final. The command passed down the line without needing to be repeated. Forward. We didn't charge like a wave, we advanced like a door closing. Step by step, shields locked, spears held steady, the whole line moving as one body. The mist swirled around our knees, then around our waists, as if the land itself was trying to hide what was about to happen. The coalition answered with noise, different cries layered together, Norse and Gaelic and Briton voices colliding into a single rough roar. Their movement was less uniform. The Vikings surged ahead fastest, eager to reach us first. The Scots advanced in a measured press. The Britons moved with the stubborn steadiness of men who had decided there was no other option. And then the space between us vanished. The first impact wasn't thunder, it was worse. It was the grinding crack of wood under force, iron ringing off iron, the sudden compression of thousands of bodies packed into the same narrow line. Shields slammed and stuck. Men leaned in, shoulder and hip, trying to drive the enemy backward inches at a time. In that moment, the battlefield stopped being a wide valley and became a series of brutal, crowded rooms. One room at the center, one on the left, one on the right, each with its own rhythm of pressure. In the center, our wall met Constantine's Scots. They were veterans, and they fought like it. Tight formation, controlled pushes, no wasted motion. It became a contest of endurance more than speed. Spears jobbed in short, efficient movements, limited by the crush. Men in the second and third ranks pressed forward to keep the front firm. When someone stumbled or went down, others filled the space immediately, because a gap of a hand's width could become a wound in the line. I stayed there, where the force was heaviest, where my men could see me and remember why they were holding. I did not swing wildly, no one could. In the press, you don't fight like a hero in a story. You fight in tight, restrained motions. Brace, push, strike when the moment allows, recover, breathe, brace again. The work of a shield wall is slow and relentless, and it asks the same question over and over. Can you keep your feet when your muscles beg you to step back? On the left, the fight sounded differently. That was Olaf's flank, Vikings driving forward with fierce urgency, trying to break our line with momentum. Their attacks came in bursts, heavy impacts that made shields shudder and arms burn. For a moment, part of our wall bent, a small section loosened, the mist churned with movement as enemy shapes pressed into the weakness. And then Edmund, my brother, held it together. Young, bloodied, refusing to give ground, he drew his best men into a tight wedge and pushed back into the breach, not with reckless speed but with controlled force. They moved like a hammerhead, close, compact, relentless. The line reformed, the opening closed. The Vikings were denied the one thing they needed most, a clean break they could widen into victory. On the right, our men met Owain's Britons in a grinding contest. They fought hard, not with the wild hunger of raiders, but with a stubborn defensive fury. They tried to lean around the edge of our formation, probing for a turn, looking for a way to fold our flank. Our veterans absorbed it, shield to shield, step by step, holding the shape even as arms trembled and shields splintered. As the sun climbed higher, the mist began to thin, not all at once, more like curtains slowly pulled aside. The valley emerged in harsh daylight, broken ground, scattered gear, lines still locked, men still pushing, still breathing hard through clenched teeth. Hours passed, not in a clean sequence, but impulses. Surge, hold, recover, surge again. Neither side gave way, not fully, not yet. And that, I realized, was its own kind of victory, for the moment. Because the coalition had come expecting a swift collapse, a frightened kingdom that would fracture under the first hard pressure. By midday, Brunanburh no longer felt like a battle you could win with one brave push. It had become something colder, an argument fought with breath and muscle, answered inch by inch. The mist was gone now. The sun hung high, pale and unforgiving, and the valley lay exposed in harsh light. Trampled grass, broken spear shafts, shields scarred and splintered, men locked so close together they could barely lift an arm without striking a shoulder. The sound never stopped. Not cheers, not music, just the constant grind of wood, iron, and voices turned hoarse from shouting orders that only the nearest men could hear. I was still in the center, where the pressure was heaviest, where Constantine's Scots leaned into us with the discipline of veterans. They fought like men used to harsh borders and harsh winters, steady, controlled, stubborn. But even the strongest line has limits, and by midday I could see those limits beginning to show. Not in a dramatic collapse, not yet, in small signs. A shield that lifted a fraction too slowly, a man who turned his head to look back just once, as if checking whether he still had an exit. A momentary hesitation before a renewed shove. These were not failures of courage, they were the first crocks of exhaustion, tiny fractures that spread when a plan depends on quick victory and the victory refuses to arrive. I looked left. Edmund was still holding, still rallying his wing against Olaf's Vikings. But it was different now than it had been in the morning. The Vikings had come in like a storm, fast, fierce, convinced they could smash through by sheer force. Now they were still dangerous, still aggressive, but their rhythm had changed. Their attacks came in shorter bursts, with longer pauses between. Their feet were heavier, their shoulders lower. Their eyes, some of them, no longer looked forward with certainty. They looked sideways, they looked back. That is the moment an army begins to lose more than men. It begins to lose belief. On the right, my veterans had endured Owen's Britons for hours. The Britons fought with a kind of desperate determination that is hard to break, because it isn't fueled by greed or pride, it's fueled by the fear of being erased. They pushed, they held, they pushed again, trying to turn our flank, trying to find any weakness that would let them fold our line from the side. But my right wing did not fold. Instead, it hardened. And the longer it held, the more the Britons began to sense something that changes every decision on a battlefield, that staying in place might become more dangerous than moving away. Owen's men were not cowards, but they were not blind. They knew that if their block gave ground at the wrong moment, they could be pressed into the valley with no space to recover. They knew that if the Vikings wavered and the Scots were pinned, Strathclyde could be left to take the full weight alone. That is what makes alliances fragile. When the cost rises, everyone begins doing the same calculation at the same time. Who will break first, and will I be the one trapped when they do? I watched and I waited. A king doesn't always win by fighting harder. Sometimes he wins by seeing the moment when the other side begins to fight with doubt. Then the moment came. On the English right, one of my commanders found the smallest opening. Nothing dramatic, just a weakness in the Briton line where men were too tired to close a gap quickly. My veterans leaned into it. Shields tightened. Spear points drove forward in short, controlled motions. The Briton front shuddered. And then a section gave way. Not the whole line, just enough for the shape to break. The Britons fell back in disorder, trying to reform, trying to hold their cohesion, but the ground was churned and the pressure was constant. Once a line loses its clean edge, every man starts seeing a different battlefield. Orders become harder to carry, trust becomes thinner. I saw the opening and I understood the truth of it instantly. This was not the time to keep surviving. This was the time to end it. Edmund saw it too, faster than I did maybe, because the young sometimes recognize opportunity without hesitation. He committed reserves that had been held back for exactly this kind of moment. Mounted men, not to win the battle alone, but to strike at the exposed edge while the Britons were trying to turn. The impact didn't need to be glorious to be decisive. Horses and riders moving with controlled speed along the flank, hitting a formation that was already losing its shape, forcing it to scatter, forcing it to choose movement over resistance. The cry rose up from our right like a spark catching dry grass. They break, the Britons break. That single shift changed the whole field. Because battles are not only fought with arms, they are fought with perception. The moment men believe the side next to them is failing, the mind moves faster than any weapon. Olaf's Vikings heard it. They saw movement on the far side and understood what it meant. One part of the coalition was pulling away. The promise of a quick victory was gone. The risk of being trapped was suddenly real. Their confidence wavered. And when a force like that wavers, when men who came for conquest begin thinking about escape, the shape of the fight changes instantly. Constantine tried to hold the center. I could see it in the way he stayed forward, in the way his men tightened around him, in the way the Scots still pushed with stubborn discipline. But now he was doing it without support on the edges. He was holding the strongest part of his alliance while the weakest parts began to unravel. That is how even good generals lose battles, not because they are beaten at their best point, but because the field collapses around them. I felt the change like a current under my feet, a slackening in the enemy's push, a half step back where there had been no room to step back before. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Not a moment of glory, a moment of decision. I raised my voice and I didn't dress it in poetry. I didn't need to. Forward, I commanded, for England, now. The words hit the line like a release. My men surged, not recklessly, not as a mob, but as a wall that suddenly remembered it could move. Shields stayed locked, feet drove into the mud.
By late afternoon, the battle was no longer one clean line across the valley. It had broken into movement, scattered groups retreating, small knots of resistance forming and dissolving, commanders trying to gather what they could while daylight slipped away. The air felt different too. Less fog now, more dust. Less morning chill, more sweat drying on iron. The sun hung low enough to throw long shadows across the churned ground, turning every spear shaft and shield rim into a black line against the light. Victory was taking shape. But victory, I had learned, can still become disaster if you let discipline collapse into hunger.
So I kept the pursuit controlled, not because my men lacked fury, but because the field after a break is full of traps, uneven ground, sudden bottlenecks, pockets of enemies who will fight hardest when they believe they have nothing left to lose. A king who wins a battle and loses his order in the lost hour can turn triumph into a new crisis. That was why I was still moving forward with my household troops close, scanning for danger that hadn't yet ended. Near a small copse of trees on the edge of the field, I saw one of those dangers. A group of Scots had fallen back into a tight knot, shields raised, backs to the trees. They were not running, they were holding. And at the center of them, I recognized the figure I had expected to find sooner or later. Constantine. The old king was still there, still standing, still fighting with the grim pride of a man who refuses to become a story about defeat. His hair was damp, his face streaked with grime, his shoulders heavy under mail and years, but his eyes were bright with something that had nothing to do with hope. It was grief. It was rage. It was the terrible clarity of a ruler who believes he has already paid the price and has nothing left to bargain with. Later, we would know that his son had fallen on the field. Even without that knowledge, you could see it in the way Constantine moved. Not reckless, not wild, just hard, as if the world had narrowed to one final act of defiance. He saw me too. Across a short stretch of trampled grass, our eyes met. There are moments in war when words are unnecessary, because every intention is already written on the face. Constantine raised his sword, not with ceremony, but with challenge, an invitation and an accusation in the same gesture. You took everything, his posture seemed to say. If you want the lost piece, come and take it yourself. My men shifted around me instinctively. Huscarls tightened their grips, ready to step in, ready to finish what the day had begun. They had earned the right to want it ended quickly. But this was not a moment for a rush. A king must know when to let the army do its work, and when to step forward so the work does not become chaos. I raised my hand, palm down, and my huscarls held, not because they loved holding back, but because they understood what that gesture meant. Discipline first, always. I stepped into the open ground between the two groups. The light caught the edge of my shield. The wind moved the leaves behind Constantine in a slow, uneasy tremble. Dust floated in the air, golden in the lowering sun. We came towards each other carefully. Even in the heat of victory, you don't run into a blade, not if you intend to live, not if you intend to stay king. Constantine struck first, the motion tight and controlled. No wide flourish, just a practical cut meant to force a reaction. I met it with my shield, absorbing the impact through my forearm and shoulder. The jolt was real, the kind that travels into bone. I shifted my weight, kept my feet, and answered with a short counter that made him step back. We circled in small steps, the way men do when the ground is slick and the body is tired. Each movement had to be earned. Each correction had to be made instantly to stay balanced. Mail does not make you unstoppable. It makes you slower, heavier, and harder to kill. But it punishes every careless motion. Constantine was older, but he was skilled. He used his shield like a wall, his sword like a tool, conserving strength. He fought as if he understood exactly how little time he had left before exhaustion would make the decision for him. I fought the way I had learned to fight as a ruler, not to look heroic, but to stay alive while ending the threat. Steel met wood, wood met steel. Blades scraped, shields jolted. The sounds were sharp and close, but the world around us felt strangely distant, as if the battle had moved away and left this small circle of men to decide something symbolic. Around us, bodyguards on both sides held their positions, tense and ready, but restrained. A Scot took an instinctive step forward, and one of my huscarls pressed him back with a shield, stopping the moment from becoming a brawl. I lifted my hand again, keep back, and my men obeyed. For a heartbeat, the duel paused. Both of us breathing hard now, dust in the mouth, sweat cooling in the wind. I could see it in Constantine's eyes. Not fear, not surrender, but the knowledge that the field had already decided the larger outcome. What remained was pride, and pride can be dangerous. Then Constantine shifted, and his heel caught uneven ground near the roots of the edge of the trees. It was only a fraction, but fractions matter when everything is tired. He recovered quickly, he was no fool, but the moment showed me what time was doing to him. I stepped forward, not with a wild strike, but with pressure. A shield bump to disrupt balance, a short movement to force him backward again. The goal wasn't spectacle, the goal was control. He resisted, he steadied, he raised his sword again. But behind him, the trees were too close, and around him, his men were thinning. The world he had tried to shape that morning was collapsing into retreat. Somewhere above us, a raven landed on a branch. Just a bird, just a shadow against the light. But in that moment, it felt like the battlefield itself was watching. Then Constantine's bodyguards moved in. They were loyal, and they were practical. They tugged at him, pulled him back toward the cover of the trees. He resisted for a heartbeat, like a man refusing to accept the shape of defeat. And then, slowly, he yielded a step. Not because he had surrendered his crown, but because survival for a king sometimes means living to rebuild what the day destroyed. He retreated into the copse with his men closing around him. The light under the trees swallowed them quickly, turning armor into flickering shadows. My huscarls looked at me, waiting, wanting to pursue, wanting to finish it. I lifted my sword slightly, and then lowered it. Chasing a cornered king into trees at dusk was not strategy, it was risk. The day had given us what we needed. I would not throw it away for pride. I stopped at the tree line and watched the Scots vanish into the dark.
By the time the sun began to drop, the valley no longer felt like a battlefield in motion. It felt like a place trying to go quiet again, slowly, unwillingly, after carrying too much noise. The dust settled in thin curtains, the wind cooled, and the men who were still standing started to realize something that only comes after the danger passes. They were alive, and many of their friends were not. I gave the order to stop pressing forward. Some of my warriors wanted more. That's the nature of victory. Momentum tempts you into carelessness. But I'd seen enough war to know what happens when a tired army chases too far into unfamiliar ground. You don't just lose men, you lose control. And control is the difference between a victory that strengthens a kingdom and a victory that breaks it. So we held, we gathered ourselves, we took the field, and we kept our shape. Across the distance, the coalition did what broken coalitions always do. It separated into survival. Scots pulled north toward their hills. Strathclyde scattered away in smaller groups, desperate to get clear. And the Vikings, Olaf's men, fell back toward the coast and the ships that could carry them away from the weight of this day. Olaf himself escaped. I did not see him with my own eyes, but the reports were clear enough. He fought his way out with a bodyguard and left the field with only a fraction of what he had brought. He had crossed the sea for York and for glory. He returned to Dublin with something colder, the knowledge that England would not fold simply because he demanded it. Constantine withdrew in better order than most, but the price he paid was the kind that follows a king long after a battle ends. His son had fallen. In our world, that wasn't only grief. It was the loss of a future, of a successor, of continuity, of a piece of the realm's tomorrow. I took no pleasure in that, not because I suddenly became gentle, but because I understood what it meant. History does not ask permission when it takes. It only takes. When the last light faded, my men began the grim work that follows every great battle, finding their own. You don't realize how large the field is until you're walking it slowly, calling names into the dark and listening for an answer that may never come. Torches appeared, small, unsteady stars in the mist. Men moved in pairs and small groups, lifting shields, turning bodies carefully, checking faces, pulling the wounded back toward the fires. The sounds changed, less shouting now, more quiet speaking, more prayers, more long pauses where no one spoke at all. I walked among them, not as a symbol, as the man responsible. I saw the tired discipline that still held even after everything. Household troops stacking shields in neat lines, officers using hand signs because voices were too hoarse, feared men, farmers called from their fields, moving with the careful seriousness of men who had been forced to grow older in a single day. And I understood something important. We had not only survived an invasion, we had survived the first true test of a new identity. England as a kingdom had been declared earlier, but on this field, England became believable. That night, we buried and tended our own as best we could. There is no perfect dignity on a muddy field with cold wind and limited time, but we did what we could. We marked graves, we planted simple crosses, we gathered what names we could, because names are the first thing history tries to erase. Beyond our camp, the coalition fallen lay where they had dropped. In the darkness, ravens gathered. It was not cruelty to leave them. It was a message, the way messages are written in our age. A warning to any ruler who thought England could be pulled apart with one great stroke. But victory is not only what happens on the ground. Victory is also what gets remembered. In the days that followed, I knew we had to shape the story of Brunanburh before others shaped it for us, because a new realm doesn't survive on battle alone. It survives on shared memory. That is why the chroniclers mattered. That is why the poets mattered. In our time, a poem could travel farther than an army and last longer than a king. The tale of Brunanburh would be set down in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, not as a dry report, but as a declaration that the greatest coalition assembled against the English had been broken, and that the English had stood together as one host. Modern people sometimes call that propaganda, as if it makes it less real, but I would call it something else, nation building. A kingdom is not only walls and roads, it is the story people tell themselves about who they are and what they have survived. By morning, the coalition survivors were miles away, running towards Scotland, towards Strathclyde, towards ships bound for Dublin. Behind them, the field fell quiet again. The fog returned, the wind smoothed the grass where it could, and the land began, slowly, to hide what we had done upon it. My army could not stay. We were exhausted, wounded, and carrying our dead. So I gave the order to march south. Not in celebration, in silence. As we moved away, I looked back once at the valley. It was just land again. Hills, low ground, mist, a place with a name that might not even be certain in the mouths of ordinary people, but I knew what it would become in memory. Brunanburh would be remembered not because its location was clear, but because its meaning was. A storm had come to break a new kingdom. And the kingdom, still young, still fragile, had held.
People later called Brunanburh the birth of England. I understand why. Standing on that field in the days after, it felt as if something had shifted in the ground itself, as if the island had decided, for the first time in generations, to accept one name under one crown. But if I'm honest, England wasn't born out of nothing that day. It had already been taking shape for years, through law and coin, through fortified towns and hard marching, through uneasy agreements and stubborn obedience. Brunanburh didn't create England from thin air. What it did was prove that England could survive. That matters more than people realize, because a new kingdom is always most vulnerable at the beginning, before unity becomes habit, before borders feel permanent, before the men who live under the banner start thinking of it as their banner rather than the king's. Brunanburh was the moment that belief stopped being an idea and became something you could hold in your hands, like a shield rim, like a sealed writ, like a coin stamped with authority. Still, victory has a strange silence to it. After the noise fades, you don't feel triumph first. You feel the weight. You feel the cost. You hear how many names are missing from the roll call. That evening, as the light fell and the mist began to creep back into the low ground, Edmund came to stand beside me. My brother was spattered with dust and sweat, exhausted in the way only a man who has survived hours of pressure can be exhausted. He looked across the valley and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he asked quietly the question that always follows a great battle. Have we held it? He didn't mean the field. He meant the thing behind the field, the idea, the fragile structure we had been building with every campaign and every oath. I told him the truth as simply as I could. We've held tomorrow, I said. The years after, we hold those with law, with good rule, with making people believe they belong to something bigger than the Shire line. That's the part people forget when they tell stories about battles. A battle can save a kingdom for a season. It can even save it for a generation, but it cannot do the slow work of governing. It cannot keep roads safe by itself. It cannot make farmers trust that their harvest won't be taken by the next warband that appears out of the fog. That kind of peace is built in quieter places, at burgh gates, in courts, in markets, in the steady rhythm of predictable rule. And that was the real legacy of Brunanburh. It bought us time to keep building. From a modern point of view, you might say the battle was an existential test for a new state, a moment when the entire project could have collapsed back into the older pattern, small kingdoms, shifting loyalties, endless raids and border fights. If we had lost that day, England might have become a brief experiment and nothing more. Because the coalition didn't come to negotiate, they came to break the structure before it could harden. They failed. But I won't pretend that one victory made the future simple. I did not live long after Brunanburh. I died in the year 939, and the moment I was gone, the north shifted again, as it always does when power changes hands. Northumbria, especially, remained restless, too important, too contested, too exposed to be quiet for long. Olaf Guthfrithson, yes, the same Olaf who came against me, returned to York after my death and held it for a time. The island doesn't change overnight. Enemies don't disappear because you win one great battle. They adapt, they wait, they test your successor the way they tested you. That is another hard truth of kingship. Your victories are never yours alone. They belong to the kingdom only if the kingdom can survive you. Olaf did not reign forever. He died in the early 940s, and his moment passed the way so many moments pass in the north. Bright, dangerous, brief. Constantine II, the old king of Alba, did not vanish either. He retreated, bruised and grieving, and a few years later he stepped away from the throne and into the church. Some men interpret that as weakness. I interpret it differently. A king who has lived long enough learns that power is not a single straight line. Sometimes you fight, sometimes you withdraw, sometimes you hand the burden to another generation because your realm needs a new pair of shoulders. Constantine's defeat did not end Alba. It did not turn Scotland into England, but it did change the balance.
After Brunanburh, no northern ruler could pretend England was temporary. They had to plan around us. They had to respect the weight of a crown that could gather men from different regions and keep them standing together under pressure. And that is what people mean when they say Brunanburh was the birth of England. Not that the land was created, not that the people appeared for the first time, but that the idea became hard enough to resist a full storm. If you look at it with modern eyes, you can see the pattern clearly. Nations are not only bloodlines, they are shared systems: law, currency, defense, administration, and shared memory. They are what happens when people start believing that their future is tied to strangers they may never meet, simply because those strangers live under the same rules in the same banner. Brunanburh became part of that shared memory. The chroniclers wrote it down, poets shaped it into words that traveled farther than armies ever could. And once a people carries a story like that, once they can say, "We stood together and we did not break," it becomes easier to stand together again the next time. In the end, the dragon didn't fly into the sky. It stayed on the earth, on poles, on cloth, in the hands of tired men who had decided not to separate. England was not a miracle. It was a choice repeated under pressure, and Brunanburh was the day that choice held.